to Mind Escape. Are you ready?
Are you ready to escape your mind?
Hello, Mind Escapees. If you have not already, please go check out my other channel, Masters of Rhetoric. I will have the link down below. It's also part of the Mind Escape LinkTree link. It's something I'm very passionate about, where I dissect the origins of Western thought through the pre-Socratic thinkers, all the way to Aristotle, and I'm probably going to go beyond that as well at some point. But right now I'm focused on the Ionian physicists all the way to Aristotle. So please support Masters of Rhetoric. Go check out our YouTube channel and subscribe. There's tons of shorts on there already, as well as episodes. And there's a bunch of episodes lined up. I'm on all audio platforms with it. And if you're on TikTok, Instagram, X, or any of the social media platforms, please go check out our page on there as well. I'd really appreciate it. Thank you. Today I am joined by friend of the show and amazing glass artist, Andrew Tischler. Andrew's been on the show many times from the beginning, pretty much. Last episode I did with him, we discussed The Bicameral Mind by Julian Jaynes. Please go check out that episode. It's phenomenal. And yeah, we're just going to be talking about Rudolf Steiner today. And please go check out his work. If you haven't already and you're on Instagram, go check out Andrew's page at @Tischler_glass. I will include a link down below. As always, you can support Mind Escape by clicking our Linktree as well. So without further ado, here we go. All right. Welcome back on, Andrew. How are you?
Good. How's it going?
Good. Last time we spoke, or I had you on, we were discussing The Bicameral Mind by Julian Jaynes, and that went over very well. Very interesting topic. At very least, if nothing else, it's an amazing thought experiment on how to think about consciousness and language and the past and everything.
Yep.
So if anybody doesn't know Andrew, who's a friend of the show, he's been coming on kind of since near the beginning of Mind Escape, which started over 8 years ago. And obviously this is a new chapter, new Telos. But Andrew is a glass artist, and a sick one at that. So go check out his art at @Tischler_glass on Instagram. And I have a few of his pieces, a couple of his marbles, and yeah, amazing fractal work if you were into that kind of a thing. All right. Well, today, though, we've talked in the past about Rudolf Steiner, and I thought we'd revisit that since I'm running that Masters of Rhetoric philosophy channel and looking at the origins of Western thought. I think Rudolf Steiner is an interesting one in the sense that he's kind of more spiritual, and actually looked down upon by other philosophers because of that. So I think that it's an interesting thought, because I think a lot of people maybe even consider themselves more spiritual than religious anyways. So, what are your thoughts on Rudolf Steiner? Kind of maybe actually give us a little bit of a background, and then we'll kind of work our way into his philosophies.
He was born in 1860 in Kraljevec, which is, I forget what country it is now, but right in the middle of Europe. He went to like a technical high school, which is like a sort of blue-collar high school. So he wasn't necessarily on like a super academic track, and his family wasn't rich or anything like that. His dad worked for the railroad. He grew up in the country, hiked back and forth to school and all that kind of thing. And he was already reading Kant at 16. So at some point, his academic and intellectual gears just kind of kicked in, and already in high school, he's thinking about problems of philosophy and physics, science, and all that kind of stuff. So even though his family wanted him to sort of work as an engineer, he was able to, he ended up getting a degree in philosophy, and again, studied science the entire time, and super well-rounded guy, but background in philosophy and science really before all the spirituality and stuff started. So a pretty technical guy.
Do you know what the catalyst was from him kind of switching towards more of the materialist or scientific side of things into more of the spiritual and non-material things?
Yeah, that happened when he was about 40 years old, or at least publicly the switch occurred. In his 30s, he spent all of his 30s trying to establish himself as like the heir, honestly, to Nietzsche, as like the eminent German philosopher, or as a sort of very public philosopher. And because he never managed to attain that level, he didn't get the sort of positions at universities. He wasn't read by the people he wanted to be read by. At 40, he was invited to speak by the Theosophists. And if your audience knows anything about the Theosophists, they were the spiritual people in Europe at the time. And so he had been having his spiritual experiences, most of his life, but especially in his later 30s. And so publicly he sort of pivoted when he was invited to speak and quickly took off in that scene. Sorry, I'll add on to, he had a lot of friends, that were really annoyed with him and sort of dismissed him even then when he started lecturing to these weirdo theosophists about spirituality and didn't understand why he'd sacrifice his reputation and stuff, but obviously he had a different plan.
For sure. When you look at, I think most people that are familiar with them know about anthroposophy. Can you describe, it's described as a spiritual science. He's kind of thinking about a new way to think about these things. Can you kind of frame that in a way to the audience that they might, understand, or break it down for us, please?
Yeah, I think something I've been thinking about with Steiner is he's all of his influences occurring right at the Industrial Revolution. So that is like, I think, something we have to take into account with Steiner is everything is post-Industrial Revolution. So people are realizing that they're getting divorced from nature. The way that the way that the world works is changing. Everything is modernizing. Technology is coming in, and sensitive people are starting to see that that's affecting the sort of spirituality that they are feeling in their lives. And so a lot of Steiner is giving advice for modern people. Also, he's trying to, he sort of, puts himself in the position to publicize esoteric traditions that had been kept secret for hundreds of years. So he's trying to square all at the same time the Western philosophical tradition that he learned at school with science and materialism, with modernity and the Industrial Revolution and technology, and sort of indigenous, European spirituality and esoteric traditions. And I think he's, really plugged into all of those streams. And he's the figure that's trying to put them all together for us in a coherent way that doesn't leave any of those things out. And it's a huge task.
So I was thinking about like, who could I compare him to in like the ancient canon of philosophy, or like the pre-Socratics, or Plato, Socrates, Aristotle. And I would say he's kind of like a more imaginative, speculative Plato, where Plato was kind of focused even though he had the theory of forms and this, like, I would say that's kind of comparable in the spiritual sense of things. I think Steiner was more imaginative and just speculated a lot more based on his meditations and things that he was experiencing in these deep states of meditation and stuff like that, is where Plato kind of still based things off mathematics and logic and things of that nature.
Well, I have to add that there's some lore with Steiner, and if you buy into the lore, that one of his reincarnations, his past lives, was as actually Aristotle. But so then they place Goethe, which is Steiner's main influence, as Plato. So then you have this relationship of Steiner, Goethe, Aristotle, Plato. But I think you're dead on, though, because Aristotle was like the great systematizer, which is why Steiner wrote 10,000 volumes. But because he's got the foresight of all these other lifetimes, if you believe again the lore, he's just integrated so much. So he's integrated Plato and Aristotle in a way that the two were really not integrated, in their lifetimes. So yeah, I think I think that we have both strong comparisons.
Yeah, that's interesting. I've never heard that before. And yeah, to add on to that point, because I do know a lot about the ancient Greek philosophers, you had Socrates and his student Plato, and they used mathematics and logic to drive their points home. And then you kind of evolve into Aristotle, and he kind of starts his own thing where he's using biology to drive his points home. And I think that that's kind of where I would say the difference between Aristotle and Steiner was Aristotle was more concerned about, basically materialism and biology and things that can be observed within nature. And as you mentioned, Steiner was a scientist early on. However, later on, it got more mystical and more mystical. So I think that he started to drift further away from those ideas, if you will.
Well, of course, he would call it spiritual science, not mysticism. So, but I completely take your point. Yeah.
Well, I mean, to the average, based on his own terminology, but yeah, to the average person listening to him, I don't think you can help. The first few times I listened, I'm like, this dude's super mystical, So.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Do you think Steiner's method of inner observation, or what's it called, super sensible perception? Do you think it can be reconciled with Western epistemology, or do you think that they're kind of incompatible?
I mean, I know that he would view it as the capstone, or as the capstone of epistemology, or the sort of the bridge, or it's like science is in a dead end. So spiritual science is when you turn back around, and continue to do science, but not about the materialism. You get out of the dead end that we're in culturally. So I would think he thinks they're compatible, or I think vital or necessary to each other.
Awesome. As an artist, how do you personally kind of navigate or figure out, is there some sort of line between subjective experience and objective truth? And do you think that Steiner's philosophy kind of bridges that, since he did kind of have both of those backgrounds in terms of science and philosophy?
Yeah, I think bringing in ideals, he really discusses a lot about beauty, or something like truth, or these things like love and freedom, and these are to me great, pretty objective ideals, things that beauty can be looked at as a being, like a divine being. So that's an experience we can all share. However, we all approach it from our own side of things. So I do think there is that a bridge or a relationship between looking at a beautiful piece of art. In a way, a beautiful piece of art is more objective, and then as we share in that piece of art together, we all kind of come together in a sort of a similar direction, which makes it more objective. So I think there is a relationship there for sure.
Interesting.
I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, no, totally. And aesthetics is kind of a weird thing too when you get in, like you said, breaking it down, because I could, to what you just said, is there is truth there, but then at the same time, there's also eye of the beholder type stuff too, where somebody can find beauty in things that are maybe not really aesthetically pleasing to most people.
Yeah.
When you're talking about his ontology, he spoke about spiritual worlds being layered within physical reality. From an ontological perspective, do you think that he was describing metaphors for inner states, or do you think they were literal dimensions of being?
It's a good question. Yeah. I think that, he'd want to emphasize the sort of objective reality of these kinds of beings. So I think that's the primary answer, but they are found in our experience. But calling it inner experience, I think he wants to kind of bring it more towards an objective experience, that they are, in a sense, out there, or that they are real, more real even than the sort of Maya of the material world, or that, like you said, that they're just behind and the cause of all of these material things. So if you want to account for the whole world, you have to account for them. And that they are out there in a sense. Yeah.
Does art reveal aspects of his philosophy or philosophy in general that science can't, and that also could that be kind of what Steiner was trying to do, if you will?
Yeah, he has a ton to say about art, and I could have spent a lot more time figuring out like all of the things that he wants to put forward. But as far as I can tell, like I think he recognizes that art, that having an experience with a piece of art, in a way, is a good preparatory stage for spiritual experiences, and that we can have an experience with a piece of art that is, like, again, very different than we can have with an experience of maybe a scientific experiment or a scientific theory or scientific ideas. Like that there's a power in art, just like there's a power in like something like music or all of the different forms of art that has to be felt and experienced, and that it is preparatory for more spiritual types of experiences in a really unique and important way.
Interesting. When you look at his teleology, which means purpose or meaning, and as I've discussed, this is new Telos now. He emphasized that humanity had kind of like a spiritual purpose, or a telos that was tied to freedom and consciousness. Do you find that compelling, or does that can that become too prescriptive?
Well, yeah, that's a good question. That's a good point. I think the reason I love Steiner is that he's emphasizing freedom. And it's actually, it can feel like a contradiction, is that how can you have something purposeful that's also free? And I think that's the beauty in Steiner's system and the way he defines freedom and purpose and all these things, is that you can have, we can fail at our purpose. So you can have a purpose for something and it cannot reach that purpose. And so to me, it's very compelling. It would be sad to think that we are either sort of ignorant observers or unattached observers. We're clearly here and we're conscious. And so like a life without a purpose is like an odd idea, a very modern idea. But I also don't want to be compelled to a purpose. I don't want to be a slave to God or to some, like whoever's programming.
Well, and to that point too, so you said that's kind of, even if you took it super far, like some sort of nihilistic, or, one of the ancient sophists like Gorgias or something, and just take it to the absolute limit, that, like you said, like nothing means anything or something along those lines, and we're just cogs in this machine. I kind of always come back to kind of what you said, like we are here, we are conscious, we're able to observe. So right there kind of indicates at least some level, even if it's a biological level of surviving or being alive or whatever. But I don't think you can arrive at that until you absolutely entertain, like a Cartesian doubt, or take it to this level of like actually considering that might be the case, right?
Yeah, and I get so stuck on Steiner because there are critics of Steiner who will look at his early life when he was in his 20s and like late teens. He was a huge fan of Nietzsche, and he was a fan of people like Max Stirner, who are kind of absurdists or nihilists, or and he, like anti-spiritual. Like Max Stirner is this. I don't know him that well, but he's like all about. He's just a sort of free in nihilism, like a precursor to existentialism, and just a really radical dude. And you would never think that if you love Max Stirner and you love Nietzsche, like to come out and say some of the things that Steiner went on to say. And it feels like this huge contradiction, but Steiner is able to see like the beauty. Like you're saying, you have to pass through these dark perspectives of, and again, even in the philosophy of freedom, like he's very clear that as soon as you're born, you have no predestined purpose. You have to give yourself a purpose. You have to decide upon a purpose. So you have to go through purposelessness and really feel what that means. I think you're exactly right. to go through that kind of muck and then discover purpose for yourself. I think, that's the essence of the modern life right now.
What did he ever say anything about some sort of objective purpose in terms of, like, we're talking about purposeless and creating your own purpose, and I think that's kind of where a lot of people would probably arrive at today. Like, if you asked, is there an objective purpose to humanity, I think a lot of people would say we create our own purpose. But did he have anything to say about some sort of actual reality or actual like objective purpose for humanity?
Yeah, I mean, I think the simple answer is yes. Despite our freedom, like, there is a plan for humanity, and I just think the easiest answer, and the reason I can give it so easily, is that the plan is love, or like, if you think of, if I just like imagining the person you're talking about, like, okay, there's no set purpose, I'm going to give my life purpose. Well, if you're really, really serious, like, you have to decide, like, okay, I can be a real estate agent, I can sell a bunch of people houses, and that's my purpose. And it's like, but as a philosopher, it's like, well, does that hold water, right? So as you go about the process of defining the purposes in your life, like, this is like the beautiful thing about philosophy, is that, like, there are only so many good answers, and we tend to come to them on our own, and that they can line up often with what then Steiner might say is this plan. And then again, the plan is that a bunch of spirits decide on their own that they want to become more loving, and so it's a kind of it feels like a kind of catch-22, or even a contradiction, or like he's having it both ways. But I don't know. I think even those people that want to go about their own way, they end up in the same point, is that they want to be loving people and free people, and
Yeah, I mean, I try and understand my own cognitive biases and weed them out as much as I can. But if you really, really go deep into it, and you've really thought about this, if you applied all the logical fallacies, considered all the cognitive biases, like, there's almost nothing left that makes us what we are. We are this, like, beautifully flawed learning thing, and that's kind of part of it, right? So it's kind of a weird dichotomy, because we do try and get things right as much as possible, but at the same time, like I said, there, if you reduced it to absolute nothing, there's really nothing there, if that makes sense.
Yeah, well, I think that's, again, I think we have to go through that process and get to that place where we can even ask, like, is there anything? Like, and from that point of view, I think you're right, though. I think that's the ground zero for where we start to build purpose, is being able to sit with the idea that maybe there's nothing to any of this. But that, like you said, it dispels the illusions of, like, of course, like, have a family and raise children, and there's biological needs, there's biological purposes, and, sociological, societal purposes. But when you are, into that kind of Buddhism and self-reflection, and you start to strip all that away, is there anything left? And I think what Steiner would say is that you would discover, well, first of all, I think for Steiner, and we can get towards the epistemology thing too, is you discover the self. You discover that there's this thing that is consistent. You meditate and meditate and meditate, and all the outside world is always changing, and then there's this thing that's always there. It's the self. And then you have to figure out, well, why is there a self? What is the self? And I think that's where all the things start to flower out of that, in a philosophical and objective way, but also in a sort of internal, subjective, spiritual way,
Yeah, for sure. In your practice, or your techne of being a glass artist, do you experience art making as some sort of teleological or purposeful process, moving towards something higher for yourself or humanity, or is it more just like open exploration? Do you get what I'm saying? Is it like open, or is there more to like a fixed end of it?
I mean, I definitely want to be very clear, especially for like young people and aspiring artists, or any aspiring artist at any age, is like, there was never a plan for me as far as my art making. With the glass, even, it was never like, I know I'll be more spiritual if I do this every day. I didn't have to commit to it. It definitely felt, especially, for early on, as I only was interested because it was fun and I was exploring and playing. And then even for a long time, I would think, like, okay, here I am reading all this philosophy, all this spirituality, and I'm making this art, but I don't see that they're related. And I was sort of jealous of other artists that could really put beautiful messages to their work. And I was like, I just make these pieces of glass. And I had friends and family be like, dude, but like your glass, you're in your glass. Like these things that you're talking about are there in some way, which was very relieving. But even then, it wasn't very conscious that I was putting them there. It was only later that I realized that I was following an aesthetic sensibility, and that I was bringing my whole self into what I was choosing to make, and that sort of put me in a certain direction, and my work looked a certain way, and so I started to realize slowly as I stuck with it that it was becoming, a practice, and that the play, which is easy to do, is what I want to emphasize, is that find stuff that's fun and that you play with, and it starts as play. But as it continues to grow, it can become more of a practice, and I think it does. I want to demystify it a little bit, because if you start out with such a lofty goal, it might become like hard to even approach it. But when it starts as play and then grows into that, but and again, like, yeah, not doing it on purpose, but I think you're absolutely right. I do think it becomes a practice and starts to sort of preparatory stages for meditative and spiritual experiences. So I think it's a great point.
Interesting. Yeah, and so obviously, I mean, I'm not a glass artist, but I have been a consumer of a lot of glass art in my years. It's kind of a dog eat dog community. There's a lot of cool people. There is a lot of crossover, people collaborating, things like that. But then there is this element of like, oh, this dude stole my technique, or this dude's, taking something that was like a famous technique and kind of making, like there's a lot of that kind of a vibe too. I mean, not to get too off topic, but I was just wanted to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think that's just a reflection of the world that we live in, and the society we live in, and we're in this hyper-capitalist sort of collapsing society where I always just imagine a world where if we all had our basic resources and we didn't need to fight for everything, then there wouldn't be those people that need to rip off someone because they got to feed their kid or their dog or themselves or whatever. And I think it's a reflection of the society that we're in. And
do you think it is tied to money? Real quick though, not to cut you off. Do you think it is tied to money though, or do you think that like partially it is ego? Because I can say from like as being a musician too, sure, that I can speak to. If you take somebody's like riff or something like that. There's an ego thing tied to it where it's not necessarily about how many records or plays or anything like that. It's like, I'm the one, I want to be known for this, and less about the actual monetary side of it.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, I'm thinking of now like skateboarding. Like I heard just recently someone say like, look, if someone can just like figure out how I'm doing it and they can recreate it in like 2 days, well then what I was doing is only 2 days worth of skill. So maybe I should do something that's so skilled that they can't do it. And that if you want to be ego, you can do something that I can show you 100 times and you're not going to get it because you got to, what I mean? So I kind of respect that. And it's a tricky thing. I think there has to be some of that. And it would be really nice to just be able to give everything away and not have to worry. I think it's probably a bit of both for sure. But I just think that the material circumstances affects everything, right? Like not to be a Marxist or whatever, but like even our egos is tied up in the fact that we're all struggling so much. So I think they feed into each other.
Yeah, again, I want to say that I've met a lot of cool people, lots of people that are against that kind of behavior and thinking and everything. And actually, I will say the most successful people that I've met, glass artists or whatever, in related industries, they've all been like the best ones are super cool with like, because they know that they can do what you said, which is create something that takes a lot of skill or maybe a lot of time and effort, as where somebody could copy some crazy technique, a couple days and make it look great. But really, is there a soul in that, or is it just kind of, ego based?
I mean, that's the point though, is that I always thought that if you're skilled enough to be into glass, but your whole aim is to make money, so you're looking at techniques that you can figure out which one you can do and sell the most. I just think like that's all fine, but you're actually robbing yourself of the opportunity to have that more spiritual relationship with the artistic process. And I think that's like, I think it's like, again, if we could all just have, UBI, basic income, I would give people advice is really the thing to focus on is that spiritual aspect, and that will bring you up in the rest of the elements of life too. But people are often are too worried about material stuff to believe that can work or that have faith in that. But I just think that's it, is that they're missing an opportunity to sort of to have this relationship that grows into something more. Yeah.
Awesome. So Steiner saw art as kind of like a bridge to the spiritual world. Do you think that there's still kind of this viable role for art being spiritually tied in the modern world, or do you think that it's too far gone in that regard to salvage that?
No, I mean, I'm kind of an optimist, so I think the more things get difficult, the more we need art and the things that bring us back to nature and to spirituality. It's just what's fascinating. Yeah, and so Steiner's whole thing is to be really aware of all of the problems with modern society, all of the sort of, things that can make us less spiritual. But he wants us to develop our arts and our spirituality to be so robust that it overcomes all those things. So the answer is always that it needs to be more robust. If anything, it's like, let's make better art, more affecting art. So really the question is like, what kind of art can match the state of the world that we're in and help us overcome the problems in it.
He described colors as almost like a living thing or like an autonomous force. Do you think that that's useful, or do you think about that at all when you're making glass, or have you thought about that?
I think it is useful. Again, I have such an intuitive approach that when I try to cram in like, clever ideas, I struggle with that, which is why I envy artists that can do that. So for my own practice, it's hoping that the intuitive process brings about the right. Yeah, I think the more I grow as an artist, I'd like to be more intentional. But as far as his ideas about the sort of autonomous nature of color, I do think that they're really interesting. And I think, again, they're relevant because our culture has kind of left even those experiences behind, which is an interesting question, is we no longer experience color the way that Steiner describes people experiencing it in past times. And we've also forgotten that it has that effect, or if anything, it's just gone to such a subconscious level. But given that Steiner's so much about freedom and bringing things back to the conscious, it makes sense that he's trying to remind us of these things about color and everything else.
So, I mean, when Mind Escape started and it was super woo, now I've obviously trended it more philosophical, and I'm running Master's Rhetoric, a little bit more academic style stuff. I mean, my views have dramatically evolved over doing this podcast, and doing so, I think, has made me a better, more understanding person of the world, and, even loving. But at the same time, I think that, when I look at his philosophy, some of the stuff's pretty out there. Like I don't know if there's a lecture where he's talking about like architecture and, how ancient Egyptian architecture is kind of like, very tall columns and open ceilings, and, it evolves, kind of slowly over time. And then he gets to the Greeks and kind of goes through time like that. And, and he also talks about like Atlantis and Lemuria. And look, I mean, I've had this debate with some of the ancient fringe people or the pseudo archaeology fans or whatever about Atlantis. Initially, I thought maybe, there's something, but then after, because of Troy was actually found and people didn't think Troy was a real place. So like, let's look, right. Is there any, but then you read Plato's dialogues, and I've read Plato's dialogues a lot. And it just seems like more of like an allegory, for how civilization goes. So like if we're talking about like allegory of the cave, well, that's an allegory to show some sort of paradigm shift or paradigm shifting event. is where Atlantis, I would say, is some sort of allegory for what can happen to a civilization if people aren't aware or careful, kind of a thing.
Right. Yeah, it's a tricky one with Steiner, and I'm also I trip up on it and am fascinated by the question, and I'm constantly asking people in the community for their take on it. Can we square what natural science and material science has to say about how the planet evolved and how, just like, the modern DNA. I think Steiner would have been sort of just or too early to get all the insights that DNA is providing us about the history of humanity. So it's there's that side of it, and I still hold out like a kind of confidence that what Steiner is describing sort of is a part of the human story of evolution, and that it's just I still have sort of a gray area with that with Steiner about was there an island called Atlantis or Lemuria or all this kind of stuff. With Steiner, it's so rigorous that if you take parts of his system as like credible, well, they inform the rest of the parts, and so you need ancient Saturn for Steiner, and you need Lemuria to get to ancient Greece and to explain it all, and so he at least you can try to follow the threads about why he's saying these things had to be there and all that kind of stuff. But again, I'm with you, is that it's easy to take those things and extrapolate and sort of become really entertaining in how you talk about them and have all that occur. And it sort of gets away from my through line is that Steiner is describing the evolution of consciousness. And so as far as like the material history of those civilizations, that's a much harder problem. So I tend to focus on like how he describes that our consciousness is evolving through those stages, and again, that's how I can make sense of it, and why he has to postulate such strange steps in the process and all that kind of stuff. So it's a tricky one with Steiner.
Well, and you're talking about Theosophy, Madame Blavatsky, like these were mystical people that were kind of in tune with these. Whether they're pseudo archaeology, like we've come so far now, we can kind of look at things from an archaeological standpoint or a scientific standpoint using scientific method, and to where what he was saying. I'll compare it to this, and I'm not saying that like their philosophies or anything, but when I listen to like a Steiner lecture, it reminds me of like a Manly P. Hall or like a Alan Watts style rant where he's just riffing on, the spirit or spirituality kind of a thing. Does that make sense, or do you get those vibes?
I get it. With Steiner, though, you just have to. With Manly P. Hall, he's an academic, so he's relating ideas he read somewhere else. Same with Alan Watts, and with Steiner, I just have this impression that he's trying his best to relay direct spiritual experiences that he had, often the night before or whenever, formative experiences. And with Steiner, you're just getting direct, accounts. And I think that's the difference. And yeah, he's trying to give birth to an entire system. Whereas people like Manly P. Hall has he gets to summarize, whereas Steiner's given birth piece by piece to this huge system.
So in that regard too, like, you could say, does that say something about human beings? So like if you listen to a Rudolf Steiner spiritual lecture or rant or whatever, and you identify with it, obviously there's some common thread, whether what he's saying, like forget Atlantis or Lemuria, like just take that out of the picture. Obviously something he's saying hits home with you. Do you think that could be tied to like maybe our mythological like storytelling past, and that he's tapping into a part of the imagination where that it is spiritual because it does go back tens of thousands, if not longer, years,
Yeah, I mean, I can definitely, speaking to my experience is that what brings me back time after time is that he'll drop these nuggets that I haven't heard anywhere else, that, like you're saying, sort of an aha moment that brings a bunch of pieces together for me that sits true with me. And I have to imagine that that's what people are coming back to. I mean, this is a very personal example. It reminds you of, have you ever listened to Aesop Rock, the hip hop artist that does all those complicated songs? And people have asked him, like, it sounds like there's no meaning to your songs. They're just a bunch of gibberish. And he says, like, well, if it was just a bunch of gibberish, why would anyone listen to it? Like, I'd have to be really clever to get people to listen to this stuff over and over again if it didn't mean anything, if it wasn't connecting to something about their lives. And I suppose Steiner is a bit like that, where it seems like he's just throwing a bunch of stuff at the wall, but all of a sudden you leave with some kind of coherence, something that makes sense. And yeah, so I think that's what I would, yeah.
Yeah, no, I like I said, I think that you have to go into listening to his stuff or reading his stuff with kind of an open mind, because even if you're a spiritual person, there might be ideas that are kind of conflicting to your own ideas of what spirituality are, for sure. And he's his own, to his own philosophy. If each person creates their own purpose, and his purpose is coming through sharing these direct experiences, that's still kind of subjective, right? I mean, there might be nuggets that tie to humanity or other people, or some sort of common thread, but it kind of is still his own thing too. So I think, like, we have to, with anybody, I don't know what's going through your head right now. I know what consciousness is. I know how I interact with the world, but at the end of the day, how my idea of how I think about things might be dramatically different from, in the internal workings is somebody else. So.
Yeah, I was having a debate with, another Steiner, a person that is interested in Steiner, and his idea was that Steiner misinterpreted his sort of karmic duty in this lifetime, that he got the idea that he was supposed to do objective spiritual research and share it with humanity, but maybe more of what you're talking about is that Steiner can dig out and present all the stuff that's going on in his spirit and his soul, and whatever value that has to us is all the value it has, and it doesn't have to be considered gospel or truth. And I think that's what he would say, is if it has any value, then good, but if you're living by it, you're already contradicting it, because this is a philosophy of freedom, not a philosophy of anything else. And so I think there's something to that. I think he definitely thought he was giving objective information. And again, he's working within certain traditions, so he's sharing information that's been around for 1,000 years that we just wasn't given to scholars or public access or whatever. And so I understand, and there are certainly many Steiner people, anthroposophists, that take him too literally. So it's a hard line to walk.
I've seen you. I don't go much on Facebook, pretty much at all anymore. Once in a while for check out family stuff or whatever. But I remember for a while I was watching you comment in some of those like Steiner forums on there, and some of these you just ask like some basic question, and people would just like flip out. So it's like, while he has a tight knit fan base, I think some of the people, like anything else, will take approaches to things that are said, or gospel, if you will, or something like that.
Steiner has a specific issue where he spoke about almost every topic. So if you're a gardener, you'll hear about Steiner because of biodynamics. If you're a teacher, you hear with the Waldorf. If you're an artist, you hear because of his this and that. So people approach Steiner from 7,000 different angles. And for me, I approached it for his philosophy. And I think that's a bit of a skeleton key. It lets you move a little more freely through the rest of the material, because I don't know, I feel a little more detached from things like the biodynamics or eurythmy or all of these, or again, Atlantis, or what he says about vaccines, or all this stuff. Like I'm at a sort of philosophical and a freedom thinking kind of starting point. But when you come at it with like in his medicine and you think that he has to be right about everything, I just take for granted, I'm a little bit naive, that how many people in the Steiner circles that I would fight and disagree with. So, yeah.
And when here's the thing that when we're talking about anybody spiritually related or a spiritual leader or religious or whatever, I think the problem that I always run into is we're always learning new stuff, right? So my philosophy is an ever-evolving philosophy. That's not going to change, because the second that changes, if the world ever slows down or just stops, that would be okay. Maybe we'll talk about it. But as time goes on, we're constantly learning new things, new takes. So this idea that there's some I think people get lost in the eternal truth thing. I think they think that, oh, this is true 3,000 years ago and it's true now. And that there is nuggets of truth that are like that, like from philosophy, whether it's Socratic method or Platonic thinking or whatever. There are things within that, yes, they still ring true to this day. But how do we know that that's going to ring true 1,000 years from now? How do we know all those ancient thinkers that we identify with are going to be ringing true with the 5 next generations because we discovered something new or whatever? You know what I'm saying? So it's like, that's the problem I have with a lot of this stuff is these people dig their heels in on a certain person or topic, and then they're not willing to budge or think more deeply. Like, if he was the end all be all, he'd be the end all be all, but we're still here. We're still learning. We're still figuring things out.
I think you really cleared it up there because it gets to the point of like, why are you engaging with these ideas? And often fear motivates people, and it motivates them in all these different ways. And they fear, when you have this a sort of overwhelming fear of something, you want certainty. You want to. That's where the need for certainty comes in. Is often I'm kind of skipping steps, but the root of it all is you're going through something and you need certainty, and so you turn to these things for certainty. When and anyone you turn to, and any time you use that attitude, you're asking for trouble because you want to dig the heels in because you're afraid of something, and you have to sort of settle down, and you shouldn't. It's really dangerous to approach spirituality through that fear, through the lens of fear, and I think that's often what happens. And there's all sorts of glowing beacons like Steiner that people will welcome you in and say, we have all these answers. And when your attitude is one of curiosity and open-endedness, you don't run into that problem, and you can walk into the Steiner circle and you can walk out of it. You can walk into, an atheist circle and you can walk out of it. And I think that's, to me, what clears it up is that you have to have the right attitude to any of these things.
Absolutely. And actually what you said rings true. Like anybody struggling with like mental health or like, I had severe OCD. One of the things causing these thoughts or these, looping ideas in my own head is the idea of uncertainty. So like when you have like, let's say OCD, anybody that has OCD, they want to be reaffirmed that what they're thinking is either incorrect or wrong, but then they'll still think about it to a certain level after that. So it's like what you're saying has a certain truth to it from a standpoint of like, mental health and things like that, because we all want certainty with certain things. However, I think part of this journey, at least for me, has been embracing the idea of uncertainty and just accepting that there's things that we either can't know, won't know, or it's just not in the cards, So it's accepting that while also understanding what's going on, if that makes sense.
I love it. Absolutely. Yeah. And when you can accept it, you live in a world that's like mysterious and wonderful and open-ended, whereas, closing down and certainty makes things pretty small and pretty finite. And often that illusion is shattered at some point because it's just not real. That certainty is, So.
Yeah. And in terms of when you're looking at things like that, I think most people, it's a potent drug, religion or spirituality. I remember when I was going through my spiritual awakening 8 years ago when I started Mind Escape, that was kind of part of the catalyst for this whole thing, and eventually led me kind of away from the more spiritual things through knowledge and this quest through investigating these things. Not that I don't have thoughts on things, or not that I don't have had weird experiences that I can't explain, or have heard other people's testimonies to their own experiences and things like that, but just when you can take that burden off your shoulders and you believe in that moment or within, a certain time in your life or something that there's a higher power or somebody's got your back or something like that, it's super potent and it frees you up to kind of live this like joyous life. But I think it's short lived because life happens, right? Like other things are going to come up, or they're, maybe just enjoy that period for what it is, because it's not going to last forever. When you look at the whole canon of Steiner's work, is what part of it do you like the most, or does it resonate most with you?
Yeah, I think for me it was and always will. Well, his philosophy. I think, if anyone asks me, hey, what should I read with Steiner? My bias is like start with the early philosophy stuff because he doesn't bring up Atlantis. He doesn't ask you to listen about Christ or, ghosts or any whatever the spooky stuff, for, Akashic records and reincarnation. Like, so, with the philosophy, he really, intentionally kept it pure philosophy. And for me, that's the skeleton key because you pick up his ideas about freedom, which are his ideas about love. And when I started reading Steiner, I was an atheist. So when I found out he talked a lot about Christ, it really irked me or whatever. But for me, all I have to do is replace this idea of this being of Christ with a being of love, a being of truth, a being of wisdom. And I can believe easier that there's a being of love that exists and that we, that's our sort of guiding light. And it's like, okay, cool. And you understand that without having to read any of his woo-woo stuff at all. I mean, I think there's a version of Steiner that is there was a version of Steiner that was just a philosopher. And had he just given that to the world, it would have been enough. And he says as much, is that the philosophy of freedom contains everything else that he said. It's all there if you can just put it together. So for me, it's the philosophy. But if I had to give the runner-up, it is his ideas about religion and Christ and Christianity. And just as an atheist, former atheist, whatever, like I would have never been convinced I would talk about Christianity. So for an atheist, like Steiner is the Christian to go to because he leaves out just all the junk and he fights against the junk that makes it so hard to even use words like Christianity for me. I think you can read Steiner as just a philosopher, and you can leave it there. But if you want to go for, what he the second stuff is just as good as the first. But yeah, I guess that's my answer.
What's your take on his idea of the Ahriman, if you can describe that to people?
Yeah, so for Steiner, we are tasked with becoming beings of love and freedom and wisdom. But that doesn't happen without a sort of catalyst. And for actually the catalyst is Ahriman. So Ahriman is death and illusion and materialism. And I was just reading that we can view Ahriman not as some devil, something evil, although it is evil. But it's actually it's a whole host of beings. Ahriman is not a single being. It's any being that is the beings of darkness that sort of become our trip. We trip over them. We are made stronger by them. They are like the counterforce to love. And so there are beings tasked with being these counter forces to love, and they're there to strengthen us and to make our resolve towards love stronger. And so all of the energy in the universe that's like sort of adversarial. And so he gets really into very detailed things about it, like Ahriman or the Ahrimanic spirits will use things like technology to sort of entrap humans and to trick them. And he's a sort of Mephistophelian figure, a sort of what's the Goethe sort of deal with the devil kind of thing. Like he's all of these pictures, but ultimately it's the forces against love that will strengthen us. So people often make him out to be this, very, again, like if you're a typical Christian, you'll talk about the devil and hell, and it's just scary. But Steiner gives a far more nuanced approach to Ahriman, which is that we should be thankful for all of the sort of evil in the world because it makes us more loving.
So do you think it's his idea? So Ahriman's basically, you could kind of equate it to like demon or demonic. But do you think, though, it's closer to daemon, like the ancient Greek, which is just like an entity that you kind of play off of and think about and interact with in that way? Or do you think that it is closer to some sort of demonic actuality?
Yeah, well, so with Steiner, you also have to mention Lucifer. So he has two opposing devils to love, and one is an upward one, which is Lucifer, and the other one is the downward one. So with Ahriman, you are talking about darkness, you're talking about death, and often you're talking about illusion, and you're talking about materialism and all this kind of stuff. And then there's the Lucifer, which is like the light bringer. And I think what you're describing almost reminds me more of Lucifer, which is, again, you have a positive relationship with these things, even though they're sometimes, well, there are wholly negative forces. So, but no, Ahriman should be regarded as pretty dark. It just shouldn't be scary.
Well, yeah, I mean, and you could look at like a later psychologist, philosopher, almost like a Carl Jung, and, actually investigate and play with your darker side or your darker nature, and understand that that's kind of part of it too, because without these kind of dichotomies, I know it's cliche, but without, evil, there is no good, and without dark, there is no light. So the universe kind of is a balancing act, if you will, of these different forces.
That's it. So for Steiner, you got the darkness on the left, you got light on the right, but then you have the middle, the balancing thing, which is what he's calling Christ, which, again, if you consider Christ a loving, balancing being, it's just something with these positive attributes. Yep.
All right. Before we wrap it up, we got a little bit of a new segment. Are you ready, Andrew Tischler?
Excited. Let's see if I'm ready. Yeah, let's go.
All right. I am going to ask you 5 philosophical questions and just answer them the best you can. You ready?
Yep.
What is something that you believe in that you know is probably wrong or illogical, but you are just not being honest with yourself?
Something I believe in that I think probably isn't true. Is that it? But I want it to be true? Oh my gosh. I'm the worst at these kind of open-ended things because I'll just think about it for like a half an hour. Let's see. Something. It's just tricky because I used to be a lot more nihilistic. And I have a lot of I have a lot of optimism.
Well, like, what's something that you have like an inkling, like, it doesn't even have to be like a religion or something, but just something that like you're kind of fooling yourself to believe that, like you said, nihilism, like, is like maybe this means nothing, but you trick yourself into thinking that there, doesn't have to be that, but just something along.
That's probably for me. It is that like I guess I do get worried that that there's something compelling to nihilism. I mean, this all started when I was a kid. I was just so afraid, like existing doesn't make a lot of sense. And I was in touch with that since I was 5 or 6 years old, that it doesn't make a lot of sense that I'm sitting here staring at these stars and that they're all gas things burning and I came from bugs and that I evolved. It's like I just happened to be here. And that really scared me, and it kind of started me on the path of philosophy. So the idea that is true, when I dip back into sort of the atheism YouTube and the hyper scientific YouTube, and that their arguments are so compelling, and I suppose it would be really scary to slip back into that perspective of that there's not something spiritual. I guess that's it. That there is, like, if I think there is a spiritual element to humanity, to myself. And if that weren't true, that would be a tough thing to swallow. So I guess it's, believing in a spiritual, I think it is, like the teleological thing.
Okay. Do you think there is an objective purpose for humanity? And if so, what is it?
I always think it's love. I'm pretty comfortable with love. And of course, for me, love also means freedom, but it means also knowing. So you don't just get to say I'm loving. You also have to be a scientist and a philosopher. You have to know. So, I think because it has the caveat of both freedom and knowing, I'm comfortable with the answer of love as the objective explanation. So, that's my trinity.
Okay. Number 3, do you think humans are special or separate from the rest of nature? And if your answer is yes, please give me your best example of why.
I would say, I think I emphasize the yes more than the no. And the simple thing is that we have complex language and that we create art and technologies and culture. and that our culture is so complex and beautiful that it does transcend things that the animals are up to, and that there is a very clear delineation between humans and animals.
Now, I will point out that there are proto versions of everything you just said, meaning that, some, like chimps have kind of like a culture. Animals have been known to what people think might be art, things like that. So I just want to point that out. While I kind of, agree with you, those things do separate us as terms of like how sophisticated and how complex they are. There are proto versions of that found in nature.
Well, I'll refine my answer, because I think there's something that there is no proto example of, which is that there is no animals that say I to themselves.
Okay.
Yeah, that's the, yeah.
Okay. What do you think happens when we die?
I think we rejoin our higher self, which is a complicated entity that has lived many lives, and we start to plan for our next life because we are not enlightened yet. And I think that there's a dying process. I think we review our past life, and then we prepare for our next life. I think it takes
Awesome.
about 800 years, Steiner says.
And to end it on a more positive note, what do you hope happens when we die? So I asked you, what do you think happens when we die? But what do you hope happens when we die?
I like it. I hope that we get in touch with, pure love and pure wisdom and joy and truth, and that we are sort of refilled. And I hope that instead of hell, or even a sort of bureaucratic heaven, that now we just meet our loved ones and these great ideals, and then we gather energy to get back involved in the whole cosmic plan.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Andrew. If you would like to support Mind Escape, there's many ways you can do it, but the best way to do it is to click the LinkTree link down below. I have everything from merch to our Patreon page. Our Patreon, by the way, I archived a lot of the Mind Escape 1.0 episodes on there. There is still some available on our YouTube channel and our Spotify and Apple Podcast. However, like I said, if you're looking for a specific older episode, it might be on our Patreon, which has been archived, and it's $2 a month. And there's also exclusive content on there as well that was never released to any other platform. So please go check that out. You can also check out our documentary that Maurice and I made a few years ago called As Within, So Without, From UFOs to DMT. That is available on there as well. There's also a director's cut. Please click the subscribe button and follow us. And if you're listening on an audio platform like Spotify, we do have video on Spotify as well. And please leave us a nice review. We would really appreciate that.